Hey guys, I'm Greg Lester and this is Game Audio Analysis, and today we'll be examining the sound, or rather the lack of it, in Playerunknown's Battlegrounds, also referred to as PUBG. I personally die a lot in this game, and dying isn't exactly fun, because you can't simply respawn and try again. Instead, you have to go through the matchmaking process once more, select a drop-off point, get into early game fights, which might cost you your life once more, rigorously scavenge for loot, run for ages into the white circle if you didn't find a vehicle in time, and then possibly lay in wait for enemies for a really long time. I'm always tense and on the watch for anyone lurking in the cover of trees, snipers on top of hills, or ambushes on bridges or in houses. And when you're playing with friends, it's quite a fun experience because you can provide cover and lookouts, but when you're alone, then the silence of the game seems almost deafening. What really stood out to me though when playing the full version of the game is that there is no music whatsoever after the initial menu screen. But what amazed me even more is that because of this lack of music, I felt so much more immersed in the game world. PUBG doesn't require you to know any deep background, story, or lore. It doesn't need an epic orchestral score or an uplifting 8-bit soundtrack to keep you company on your journey. Instead, it utilizes silence to constantly keep you on edge. The question we have to ask ourselves here is how and why does this work? Well, the main psychological concept behind it is that we fear the unknown, which in this case are enemy players, who could be anywhere and might already be lining up a headshot. Silence means that we do not know where the enemies are located, and thus need to be on the lookout. As soon as we hear guns, the tension we felt is heightened for a moment, and then released and replaced by either anticipation or fear on the decisions we make. Now, we either approach and engage the enemy, or we run and hide. There are little to no ambient sounds in the game, which emphasize the louder sounds such as footsteps, vehicles, gunshots, opening doors, and breaking glass, which are the most important sound cues for the player. They tell us where the enemy is located and will help us make the fight or flight decision to win the game. The lack of ambient sounds also makes the player feel exposed and vulnerable. It strips the cover from you, because each step you make is loud and clunky, and each shot can be heard from a very far distance, which will compromise your position. This is mirrored in the world design of the game as well, where we can find a lot of fields with little to no cover, and the trees are oftentimes spread just that little bit too far away for you to sprint to the next one without being discovered. Another factor of why this lack of sound and music works is that the game is not built around exploration and stunning landscapes, but rather survival, stealth, and tactical positioning. All we need is the information to do these things, and anything which distracts from that important information will be useless to the player, and thus a hindrance to the actual gameplay. On top of this, there is a high consequence for dying, which is that you have to start again from the beginning, which can be really frustrating and time consuming. If Battlefield 1, where you have a 10-second respawn timer, had the same consequence that each time you died, you would have to wait until the entire rest of your team died before you were able to respawn, it would create a lot more tension and make the player play more careful. This would require an entirely new approach to the sound of the game due to its chaotic and fast-paced nature and the historic setting the soundscape has to envelop the player in. Changing this would take the player right out of the action and make it a slow and tiresome experience. So we know now that this use of silence only works in certain circumstances. Now let's compare it to Fortnite's Battle Royale mode, which shares the same core mechanics but has a couple of different features and a completely different art style than PUBG. The map is a lot smaller in Fortnite, and thus the actual time for a game from start to finish is a lot shorter than in PUBG, which makes it more casual and less competitive. It doesn't feel like you have to plan ahead each move with precision, but rather just run somewhere, pick up a gun, and fight my opponents. The sound design really reflects the more casual gameplay and colorful world by making the weapons sound more surreal with less weight to them. The swinging of the pickaxe sounds like a swish of a stick. The hidden golden chests have a wonderful shimmery pulsating pad sound which draws the player in. When you kill a player, his loot empties onto the ground with a futuristic robot sci-fi scanning sound, and there are a lot of positive bleep feedback sounds when the player collects things or heals himself with bandages. So after investing a fair few hours into both games and comparing them to each other, I really have to say that Fortnite's plethora of beautiful sound effects really please my ears, and the sound cues like the warning when the storm comes, as they call it in the game, which refers to the shrinking circle, are really effective. Fortnite's ambient soundscape is also incredibly quiet and puts an emphasis on the player-generated sounds in the mix. Nonetheless, both games have very distinctive identities and optimize their sounds to benefit the gameplay experience. So now we're going to do a technical deep dive into how the sound propagation in PUBG works and how the vehicle sounds were made using granular synthesis. PUBG sound effects leader Kyung-won Park and the action and gunplay programmer Marek Krasovsky have released a development blog post about these two topics. The link to the articles are in the description. Short disclaimer, most of the information below I have taken directly from the blog post without modifying it too much because I think it explains the topic really well. So let's dive into the gun sound physics of PUBG. Each gunshot sound you hear in game has a propagation delay based on the distance of the sound source and the player. A propagation delay is the time difference it takes of the sound to travel from the source to the listener. The propagation velocity is 340 meters per second, so if a pistol is shot 340 meters away in game from the listener, he will see the muzzle flash first and hear the gunshot after 1 second. If the gunshot is fired from indoor or there is no direct or approximate line of sight to the enemy, so it's obstructed, a reverb effect and low pass filter are applied to the sound effect. These effects help make it seem more realistic because we place the sound, in this case the gunshot, into an artificial environment, and because of the reverb, we hear what the gunshot would sound like in a small or large indoor space, where the sound waves bounce back and forth from the walls, as well as the long tail of the gunshot we would hear outside, where the sound waves scatter in every direction without any reflective surfaces. Because high frequency sound waves are shorter, they either get absorbed more easily by materials from houses like brick, or lose all of their energy when traveling long distances. So the low pass filter emulates this phenomenon and thus makes it a lot more immersive for the player. So now to the bullet crack and whiz effect. The bullet crack effect, or otherwise known as the bullet bow shockwave, is generated when a supersonic projectile passes in close proximity to the listener. The effect can be heard at the closest point on the bullet trajectory lane. Basically, the sound source is always perpendicular to the trajectory line. So if you hear a bullet crack just in your left earphone, you know that the shooter is either directly in front of you or behind you. Most of the weapons in PUBG are supersonic, meaning that they are faster than sound. This means that you will hear the crack and the whiz before you hear the actual gunshot. In a scenario where you see a shooter 1000 meters away using an AWN, which has below 900 meters per second muzzle velocity, the events will occur in such order. First you will see the muzzle flash. Then, after 1 second you will hear the crack and the whiz, and finally after 3 seconds you will hear the gunshot. Bullets passing close to the player will generate a crack sound. The ones passing further away will only generate a whiz effect. The sound designers blend between different sound samples based on distance. The close gunshot sounds are louder and more clear than the distance ones. The maximum distance and attenuation characteristic is also affected by the suppressor attachment. So basically, if you have a suppressor with you, people will be less likely to hear you from far away. So now let's take a look at the vehicle sounds in PUBG. In an interview, sound effects leader Kyung-won Park and action gunplay programmer Mara Krasovsky explained that to improve their vehicle sound design, they looked into granular synthesis plugins and found one called Rev that is very CPU and memory friendly. But first, what is granular synthesis and how does it work? Well, granular synthesis splits the audio signal into small grains which can be rearranged. This means that we can time stretch audio without changing the pitch and vice versa. For the sound team on PUBG, this means that they can record the RPMs, so the rotation speed, of the car engine and then through Rev, speed up and slow down to fit the driving experience of the player with the proper acceleration curve and parameters. Brandon Green, creator of PUBG, has recently released a development roadmap for 2018. In the blog article, it states that during the first half of the year, they will increase the detail of vehicle sounds by introducing suspension and more skidding sounds. They also said that they want to make surfaces reflect different weather conditions by adding rain sounds to vehicle surfaces. Another change Brendan and his team are going to undertake is to make the gun sounds more distinctly different, depending on the point of view. I really hope that this not just means the difference between switching between first and third person, but also how different guns sound at a distance so the player is able to better distinguish the threat level. In the second half of the year, they will work on the sounds that the player produces while moving so that it corresponds to the equipment they are carrying. Additionally, they're going to introduce different breathing sounds for when the player is running, aiming down sights, or holding his breath. These changes seem to be looking very promising. I believe that none of them will affect the gameplay too much, but instead be able to immerse the player a lot more. You can read the full article on PUBG's official website, the link is in the description below. Now let's jump right into my personal to-do list. Number 1, the Circle of Death. In my opinion, a really important thing to add to the sound designer's to-do list is to create a sound cue for when the circle starts to get smaller, because when I'm fully immersed in an exciting firefight, then I don't pay attention to the danger of the circle and thus often die to it. By implementing an audio cue to warn you, this could be avoided. Some might argue though that it would take away from the difficulty and thus the gameplay experience, because it means that the player won't have to actively check the timer when the circle is going to start getting smaller. Additionally to that, it might distract players or even mask important sound information like footsteps. To make sure that this isn't the case, I would make the sound cue very short, not too loud, but distinct and memorable. Something like this. Number 2, the deafening plane. The airplanes that drop crates are way too loud, and every time they fly over me, I can't hear anything. Like, it gets so loud that I can't actually hear my teammates on TeamSpeak anymore. The sound for the plane itself is also quite bad in my opinion, and it definitely needs to be updated in further patches. So for me, the third and final thing on the checklist will be an overhaul of the quality and the sounds in the game. In my opinion, there is still a lot of room for improvement in just the overall quality. If you compare the PUBG sounds to Fortnite, you can definitely hear the difference a lot. Fortnite just sounds a lot more polished and high quality, and yes, they are very different games, but in my opinion, if they would bring in someone external, like in this case Fortnite did with Chris Sweetman from Sweet Justice, they would definitely be able to step the quality up a notch. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this episode of Game Audio Analysis. Please support the channel by liking and sharing the video with your friends, and of course subscribing if you want to see more of Game Audio Analysis. You can also support me on Patreon to gain behind the scenes access to scripts and videos and view the episodes one day early. See you next time.